And we are recording. You ready to do this, John?
Absolutely. This is the way.
Excellent. So welcome to our session today at the AISES National Conference. Our session title is Indigenous Engineering Design, Ethics, and Role Models. So thank you so much for joining us today. We'll have about a 40-minute presentation, and then we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for a live Q&A at the end. So with today's session, we wanted to look at the positive connections between engineering and Indigenous peoples from both a design and an ethics perspective. The underrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in engineering is often described using that deficit mindset that focuses on the barriers that are in place to accessing the profession. Those barriers are very real, but we want to come at it from a different angle today. So we're hoping that by showcasing examples of Indigenous engineering design and relating mino-pimachiowin, or Cree ethics, to engineering ethics, that will explore how Indigenous peoples have always had engineers in their communities. And then we'll end off by just highlighting some really excellent Indigenous engineering role models that are out there. So with that, my name is Matt Dunn, and I'm joined today by the co-presenter, John Desjarlais. There
Hi,
it
Matt.
is.
Yeah.
All right, so with that, I will start sharing my screen, and we'll start off with introductions for both John and myself. So there we are, looking very professional. After we got our PN designations, we got our photos taken. We are the co-presenters today. And I'll just start off with the bio for myself and a land acknowledgement as well. So we're going to do the land acknowledgement where John and I are physically located as we record this, which is in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, up in Canada. So I am a Dene person through my mom's side. I'm a settler Canadian through my dad's side. As a Dene settler Canadian, from Treaty 8, I do consider myself a guest in these lands, which is Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. I was able to grow up here, go to school here, work here, and provide for my family. So I just want to pay my respect to the First Nation and Métis ancestors of this place. Yeah, so I'm Dene. I'm a member of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, which is up in Fort Chipewyan, up in northern Alberta on the western shores of Lake Athabasca, which is up in Treaty 8 territory. Now, I did not grow up there. I grew up in a couple different places. I grew up in Edmonton with my mom, and in a small town called Watrous, about an hour east of Saskatoon, with my dad and stepmom. So my lived experience as an Indigenous person is as an urban First Nations person and as an Indigenous person growing up in a small town in Saskatchewan, which is in a rural farming community. Now, growing up, or actually, let me talk about my family first. So I am married with two wonderful little kids. Walker on my shoulders there is my 5-year-old son. He's starting kindergarten now. And Nahani is my 3-year-old daughter. On the right is my wife, Adrian. We met pole vaulting. So we both did track and field at university for the Huskies. And she was a much better pole vaulter than me. I ended up moving on to the pentathlon. But we met and connected through sport. And now we're raising a family here in Saskatoon. Growing up, I always wanted to be an astronaut, and that was my goal. So I was going to go into aerospace engineering, but life took me down a very different path. I ended up getting my undergraduate degree and master's degree in mechanical engineering, and I worked in the mining industry for just over 6 years. So I was at a potash mine for a few years. The picture on the left is that pic was taken at the top of I think a production head frame at a potash mine. So we're actually quite high up, and you can see the Saskatchewan landscape in the background there. So I worked as a mine maintenance engineer at a couple different potash mines. And then for the past 6 years, I've been working at the University of Saskatchewan. So for 5 years, I was in the College of Engineering. And during that time, I was able to work on a few different initiatives. And one of the highlights for me was working with the college to create the IPIC Engineering Access Program. At the time, it was the third engineering access program in Canada for Indigenous students. And then for the past year, I've been working as the Indigenization and Reconciliation Coordinator in the Office of the Vice Provost Indigenous Engagement at the University of Saskatchewan. Now, volunteering and service work has always been a big part of my professional life. Here's a picture of the Engineers Canada Equitable Participation in Engineering Committee, which I was able to chair for a couple of years, and I'm now a member of the Indigenous Advisory Committee for Engineers Canada. I've also done volunteer work with AISES and with Kayak as one of the founding co-chairs. I've done some service work with the engineering provincial regulator in Saskatchewan. So that's APEGS. And that's actually where John and how we met way back in 2012. So that's enough about me. I'll stop sharing my screen and pass it over to John.
Oh, thank you very much, Matt. And so let's get to share my screen and tell you a little bit about myself. And let's start this presentation. Perfect. So yeah, thank you, Matt. So I'll talk a little bit about myself and where I'm from. In regards to land acknowledgement, I'm actually in Regina right now, which is Treaty 4, which is actually where my father grew up and raised in southern Saskatchewan. And I grew up, my father ended up north, and I grew up in Treaty 5, small little section in northeastern Saskatchewan. So I'm what they call Métis in Canada. And Métis is defined as mixed ancestry between non-Indigenous and Indigenous people. But I grew up immersed, my mother's side, in the Nenau Cree language and Cree culture in northeastern Saskatchewan. So I was raised in northern Canada. And grew up in a community at Cumberland House. We'll talk about a little bit about that later. I did a lot of different things over my years. I wasn't always an engineer, but I was always involved in STEM. And so I was a technician for many years in radiation protection and safety. Eventually got into engineering, worked at the same operation and industrial mine site for about 17 years. And then through that progressed through a variety of roles. Where I was CEO for a period of time, and then eventually moved on to general manager, which I'm currently right now of an industrial construction company, Great Plains Contracting. Eventually went and did some graduate work as well too, an MBA, governance and entrepreneurship in Northern Indigenous areas, which I'm wrapping up hopefully this year. And like I said, I'm Cree. I consider myself Cree. That's my language. And then we'll talk a little bit later in ethics in terms of and discuss what mino-pimachiowin and mino-pimachiowin mean. So look forward to that. And so I discussed a little bit about Cree, my language. There's another map there, Saskatchewan. Swampy Cree, and there's a variety of dialects of Cree in Canada. My dialect's the N dialect, and it's across northern Ontario, northern Manitoba, and then comes into Saskatchewan, Cumberland House. The community of Cumberland House has an interesting history. It's the oldest existing colonial established community in Western Canada, but the Indigenous people have been living there for thousands of years prior. And so the community itself is situated in the largest delta in North America, which makes it incredibly interesting, diverse in its ecosystem, and complex in its relationship with the Indigenous people in terms of land and sustenance. And so that's where we discuss the concepts of land and connectedness and the ability to live a good life, mino-pimachiowin. And so as a practice general manager right now for Great Plains Contracting, a company I'm incredibly proud to work for. It's owned by File Hills Development Corporation, which is an Indigenous development corporation, First Nation in Regina, working in a variety of different sectors. And so through that, I got involved in community. I sit with council as part of the executive. I was recently elected this year as the vice president of APEGS, which eventually means I'll move through the executive positions, eventually being president. Incredibly proud of that nomination and posting, the first Indigenous person with a regulator in Saskatchewan for that posting. And then through that, to sit with Education Board, the Inclusion Diversity Committee, where I met Matthew. Like sitting on that committee gave me an opportunity to reach out to people like Matthew. And then through that, we sat on the Indigenous Subcommittee. And then almost the rest is history. Right now, currently the Sask.caISES co-president with Matthew, kayak member and founder of the Canadian Indigenous Advisory Council to AISES, CAISES founding member, and CAISES 2020 annual gathering. Very involved in putting that together through Sask.caISES and with Matthew. And currently, again, still a master student. I collect them. So that's a little bit about who I am, and we'll pass it on to Matthew.
All right, thanks, John. I'll share my screen. So Sask.caISES is the Saskatchewan professional chapter of the Canadian Indigenous Science and Engineering Society. For our American audience, it's also the Saskatchewan professional chapter of AISES. It is the first professional chapter of AISES in Canada, and me and John started it last year. We had a few networking events with the University of Saskatchewan student chapter of AISES, and the other big project that we were involved with last year was the .caISES 2020 gathering. So this kept us busy for a few months, and it turned out to be just a really excellent gathering. We had over 175 participants, which was the largest .caISES gathering to date. This was the third annual gathering. We're able to get lots of great sessions, lots of great participants, lots of great sponsors as well. We're able to pull in, John was able to get quite a bit of sponsorship money, which just goes to show the interest and the demands that is there on the industry side. We had a great turnout, and I think everyone had a lot of fun. We had a K-12 day for the first time, and I think that went really well. So we're hoping to see that continue into the future. We did co-organize this with our professional chapter and with the University of Saskatchewan student chapter. So these are the co-presidents of USask.caISES. That's Michaela Marassi on the left and Julia Desetgar on the right. So everyone involved was just really great to work with. Everyone put in a lot of time, a lot of hard work. Staff from the U of S were also involved. So this was a real labor of love, and we're just glad that it turned out as well as it did. It also happened pre-COVID. Thank goodness. We missed it by like a week or two. So really fortunate in that regard. Okay, so now we will get into our presentation on Indigenous engineering design, ethics, and role models. And we'll start with Indigenous engineering design. So before we get into examples of Indigenous engineering technology and design, I'd like to start with just the definition of engineers and what do they do. So when I've given outreach presentations to K-12 students before, I always like to start with asking them, have they ever thought about engineers and what they do? Do these students know any engineers? And some students do, but unfortunately not everyone knows what engineers do. So we'll start with a definition. And there's different definitions that are out there, but I think this is a pretty succinct one. Engineers apply science, technology, and math to solve problems and make society better. So if you do remember one thing today, it's that engineers solve problems. But another thing is when we talk about making society better and we talk about all of the different communities that are part of our society, I think there are some communities who do not benefit equally. And one of the biggest examples is safe drinking water. There's still far too many boil water advisories in First Nations communities. And so when we talk about engineers solving problems and making society better, there's still some room for improvement there if we want to make all of society better. Now, being a professional engineer, it's one thing to design, like as engineers, we design things, we're solving problems each day, But being a professional engineer, and that's a designation that you need to earn through experience and by writing an exam, being a professional engineer means that you always have to consider the safety, cost, and impact that your work has on society. And so normally engineers do their job so well that you don't generally hear about them. I think that's one of the reasons why the general population does not know as much about engineers and what they do. Normally it's when a mistake has occurred that you hear about engineers. If a space shuttle explodes, or there is a boil water advisory, or a roof collapses, or a bridge collapses, then you might, then engineers might be in the press. But normally we're doing our job so well that you just don't hear about us. But imagine a world without engineers. That'd be a world without safe drinking water, without vehicles to drive, without our cell phones and laptops, without buildings, bridges, roads, all of this infrastructure that we utilize every day. And we've just listed 4 different disciplines of engineering, and we know there's a lot more disciplines out there. So there's hundreds. So it's a great career because depending on what your interest is, there's a great chance that there's a type of engineering that you're well suited for. There are lots of benefits to being an engineer. You get to use your creativity. You get to design things that matter. So again, thinking about community, it's a real opportunity to make a positive impact in your community. As an engineer, you also get to collaborate with others to solve problems. Teamwork is really important in engineering. You work with other engineers, you work with technologists, with marketing, with managers, administration. So it's a real team effort when it comes to being an engineer. You also get paid well as an engineer. It's not the most important part, but it certainly is nice. And you've got good job security and flexibility as well. So there's lots of benefits to being an engineer. We are underrepresented as Indigenous peoples in the engineering profession. And it's a shame because it is such a great career. And we've always had engineers in our community. So we're going to go through a few examples that just highlight how, historically speaking, we've had people in our communities that have designed things, that have solved problems and made life better for their family and in their community. So the first design, we're going to look at a few watercraft examples. The first design is a kayak. So this is an Inuit design, and it's a light and really maneuverable piece of watercraft. That's a great design because when you're out on the water and you're hunting, you need to be able to get around quickly. The way it's been designed, if you do happen to tip over, you can pop right back upright. And for someone to design that had to be very intentional. And that would have taken a lot of effort to figure out how to design that to allow that to happen. I love this picture as well, because there's the kayak, but there's also this other thing right here. So it looks like an inflated balloon, and I'm pretty sure it's an inflated seal skin. So that's another great example of a great design. You've got that inflated seal skin, and if you attach it to what I'm assuming is a harpoon here, then when you're out hunting, if you miss, because you're attached to the inflated seal skin, you're not going to lose your harpoon. Or if you don't miss and you hit your target and it submerges, it's going to be a lot harder for that animal to get away. So a couple of great examples of Indigenous engineering design in this one picture. The next one is another watercraft. So this is the frame and structure for something called a bull boat, which was a type of watercraft popular in the prairies. It's a more straightforward design, but it's still a really great design because you could construct it, you could put it together quite quickly. Once you've got the frame together, you would cover it in a waterproof hide. And then that would allow you, like when you're traveling, if you come across a body of water, whether it's a river or a smaller lake, you can just construct your bull boats, go across the body of water, take it apart, and keep going on your way. then the third watercraft design we'll look at is the canoe. So it's the birch bark canoe. It's a design that's really never been improved upon. The materials have changed a bit over the years. You might see fiberglass and other materials now, but when it comes to the design itself, it's never been improved upon, and that's why you see it so widely used across Canada. I also wanted to highlight teepees. So this picture was taken at the 2014 North American Indigenous Games in Regina. There's a huge storm that came through one evening, and this is what you saw the next day. So the modern tents were all blown over, but all the teepees which lined the outside were all still standing. So it just speaks to the design from a structural standpoint, from an aerodynamic standpoint as well. And inside, the ventilation within a teepee is also excellent. When you've got a fire, the smoke rises through the top and it doesn't just stay inside the teepee. So just another great example. And then the last one we'll look at is the travois. So I just want to highlight that at the University of Saskatchewan College of Engineering, they received some funding from NSERC, Promo Science, to look at examples of ancestral engineering design. And so one of the examples that was turned into a design challenge was for the travois. So this is a great activity for K-12 students where you could do it a couple different variations inside the classroom. So just at students' desks, you ask them to create a horse-drawn structure that can carry the most weight in 15 minutes. So this is a small structure they could do on their desks. And then you test it out. So they come up with their design, they build it using materials you have in the classroom, whether it's popsicle sticks, paper, tinfoil, elastics, whatever you have on hand. And then you add weights until failure occurs. And so kids have fun from that design challenge perspective. And then you can go through the travois design and relate that to Indigenous engineering design. We've also done the activity in a larger scale where we had large pieces of doweling, and we actually got people to then pull these much larger travois, pull them and have a bit of a race. So you can kind of do the two different variations. But then again, you can go through this another excellent example of Indigenous engineering design, which is the travois. Okay, so with that, I'll pass it over to John to talk about Indigenous engineering ethics.
Thank you, Matt. Just have to unmute there for a second. So we will switch over. Oh, I gotta advance my presentation here for a second. There we go. Let's flip through that. Perfect. All right, and so, you know, Matt always gives a great presentation and really highlights the fact that, you know, Indigenous people have been involved in engineering and science for, you know, as long as time immemorial, right? And so for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And so engineering is certainly not a Western construct. You know, I guess our modern understanding of it is evolving, but, you know, we understood it to be, you know, something very Western. But as we could see from a lot of those examples, it isn't, right? It isn't Western. And so people like me, Matthew, and you know, numerous others are very, very interested in, you know, the intersectionality between what we've learned and what we know as Indigenous people, our knowledge. And so through my research and through my upbringing, you know, it really brings me to my presentation and the point of engineering ethics. And so in our ethical training, common professional training, we see a lot of ethical principles. They're presented in my regulator's code of ethics, as is a lot of other jurisdictional regulators' ethics. Quite common in other professions as well too, in medicine, present ethics. And as you look at a lot of those ethics, you could see that they take a form of what you'd call duty-based. They're very rigid and thou shalt not. And so thinking about this and thinking about, you know, what ethics, what values, what virtues do I have, in particular as an Indigenous person, what was I taught, what was important in my community, it really kind of I guess almost lit my way in terms of exploring what Indigenous ethics are, and as an engineer practitioner, what those could be. And so we'll get right into that. And so overarching, as we think about values and things like that, in Cree, there's a variety of concepts, and important to this discussion is mino-pimachiowin, which stands for the ability to make a good living for oneself. It's very traditional. It's not financial in its interpretation, purely financial, I should say, but it means holistic. It's a natural law. It's a concept of which we defined as a body of unchanging moral principles regarded as a basis for all human conduct. And so it's a very important guiding concept in the Cree language. And then through that, we look at some of the words associated as pimachiowin, which is the ability to make a living. Again, it's holistic. It's about that spiritual, that physical, connection, oneself. And then through that, how do we achieve mino-pimachiowin, which is the good life? How do we live the good life? And that being, through sustainability, through, ensuring the success and well-being of our generations, of our language and our culture. And so through that, there's a code of ethics that is often presented, usually, formally in literature and through language and passed down. So we'll jump right into that. And so a lot of what those concepts are and discuss some of them. So the first one is kagewitusuin, which is the ability to develop an inner sense of industriousness, or the inner ability, the desire to be hardworking. This one, when I think about this one and you think about its application, it's incredibly important. This is a concept that Indigenous people, and a value that Indigenous people celebrated and passed on. And of course, counterproductive to, common stereotypes in North America, and in particular in Canada. Indigenous people are seen to be as, not industrious, not hardworking, people who depend on the system and things like that. As we know, and as Indigenous people, we know we peel that layer back, and there's far more to that, and some awful systems of oppression and assimilation through residential schools and stuff like that. So this was a value that was shared and celebrated for thousands of years. And so Indigenous people did need to survive and thrive in the conditions that we saw prior to contact, and that required to be hardworking and to be industrious. So the next value is Sask.caISES, which is very related to that. It's not just the desire to be industrious in that inner sense, but it's the need to work too, right? And so you want to be hardworking, but you're always looking for something to do, to help, right? And how do you contribute? How can you participate in things? And it's that desire to do that. So next one is Waskawiwin, which is the inner energy to move or develop an inner sense of personal initiative. Related to that desire to work and to participate and to provide is that initiative to, get involved and to be, enthusiastic and energetic in your activities. Nahatsiwin, which is the ability to develop alert and discerning faculties, to be aware, to always, think about what's happening around you, environment, people, and things like that. Nistutamuin, which is the ability to develop an understanding, and through that, we want to get to know, our audience, and we want to get to know the environment, and to really understand those interdependencies and those relations. It's also important in terms of how do we relate with each other, right? Understanding other worldviews and other point of views, comes to that land acknowledgement. It's a big part of that, right? And so acknowledging that we're on other people's territory and understanding who they are, being respectful of those protocols. Inisiwin, which is the ability to develop a keen mind, always sharpening that, that skill, always learning, and always, striving for continual improvement. Nai tamuin, which is the ability to develop a sense of hearing. And so that's not literally a sense of hearing, but that's, empathy, right? And so, really, listening to people, understanding their point of view, and engaging, deep engagement, right? And so, you're sitting down with people and you're always aware of your surroundings and what's happening. And so a really important one, it's especially important to me, is Ganatsiwin, which is the inner capacity for respect. And so you know, respecting the world around you, the people around you, the different worldviews, different cultures, different everything. And so, you know, respecting that, knowing your place in the world, and then celebrating it. AISES, which is the inner capacity to be kind. I mean, that's incredibly important. You know, that's an important value. That's an important virtue. You know, it's especially important right now as we see this turbulent time and you know, in North America with everything that's going on. You know, people need to think about that a lot more, and need to think about, you know, being kind and respectful to their fellow person. We'll go to in, which is connectedness and kinship, another really important. So through that being kind, you know, connecting with your shared brothers and sisters, and you know, connecting with you know, other cultures and other people and things like that. And you know, we share resources, we share lands with different people from different backgrounds and everything like that. And so that's never going to go away. So it's really important to think about that. Mino-pimachiowin, which is good relations. So through that kinship and connected, I mean, maintaining that trust and that level of you know, honesty and openness with other people, and building those relationships. And so tapwewin, another very important principle is speaking the truth, speaking with precision and accuracy. And so, you know, speaking with good intent, good relationship, be kind, but ultimately, you know, avoid deception. You know, you want to speak and act with integrity. So it's really important that you think of tapwewin. And so, you know, as we look at those, as we look at the Cree ethics, as we look at Indigenous ethics, engineering code or ethics or other professional ethics are typically, as I mentioned, a form of duties, and they outlines an engineers or professional duties to people and the environment. Whereas mino-pimachiowin code of ethics is virtue ethics. It outlines the virtues or traits that people should strive to have to make a good living and a good life. And so when we look at the differences, you know, Indigenous codes of conduct are holistic. They're about culture, they're about virtue, they're about behaviors, listening and kindness to each other. You know, pimachiowin, it's a holistic concept, and you can't separate exclusively physical or spiritual. It's not simply doing something, but it's also the virtue of being. And so those are some of the differences, but is there similarities? Absolutely. So these ethical principles, they both provide a deep level of commitment for a greater purpose, right? And so as Matt mentioned, we have an obligation for public safety and you know, minimizing and managing impact to our engineering decisions, as well as the environment. And so, you know, these principles and these ethics help to drive our behaviors in those directions. And so through that, they also give us, like I said, direction. You know what I mean? If we struggle with our choices and what to do and things like that, then they you know, provide almost a beacon, right? And so they kind of light the way in terms of what's the right thing, what's the right decision to make in regards to that. And then, of course, they develop professionalism, which is really important. And so the opportunities when thinking about, you know, common professional ethics and Indigenous ethics, well, Indigenous, you know, ethics, they help to indigenize professions. When you think about them, you know, they help non-Indigenous people, you know, think about it. They make it more accessible, right? And so that in terms of understanding Indigenous people, they're really important for Indigenous professionals as well too, because you know, they help make, you know, indigenize the professions. They start to see themselves, right? I really started to see myself in my profession as I started to understand my ethics. With younger people, they help identify with the professions a lot more when they see these different constructs, these ethical constructs come together, and the Indigenous ethics as well too. They help bring worldviews together. You know, they help to reconcile some of the things and strengthen. If you look at the ethics, the duty, and the virtue, they're stronger together. If you look at them in stereo, you know, you certainly have a more of a holistic approach to ethical theory. You know, there's personal ends and public ends, right? And so they help to become a better professional, but at the same time, they help to serve your entities, you know, according to your regulated perspective. So the other thing too is, you know, an opportunity for Indigenous people to, you know, get a strength of identity through language, through the exploring of ethics in their own language. You know, they get to strengthen their indigeneity, their Indigenous ethics. And then, of course, identification and relation, right? And so we can see ourselves better in the professions when we're better represented by those professions. So I always ask people, and especially Indigenous people, like, you know, is there an opportunity for a culturally relevant code of ethics? You know, this is certainly not innovative or new. There's a lot of, if you do quick searches in terms of culturally relevant or cultural code of ethics or Indigenous code of ethics, you'll come up with several examples. There's the Native American code of ethics. There's the 7 sacred teachings. There's the traditional Native code of ethics. There's the Indigenous code of ethics from the sacred tree. And so ethical theory has always been an important practice in Indigenous culture in terms of how do you engage and treat, and, you know, and they really focus on building, you know, a better person. And so that's a really important distinction. And I always tell people, especially Indigenous people, there's an opportunity to create an ethics of your own. I discussed mino-pimachiowin, I discussed Nena and the Cree language, but I mean, there's certainly similarities in a lot of the languages. And I always engage, you know, people who are listening and participating to explore your own language and your own culture. My grandmother, my nukum, my mom, my mama, and then of course treaty spiritual elders, right? And so engage your language in terms of, you know, what type of ethical practices there is there. Look for rules, natural laws, codes, behaviors within those language groups, and then they'll start to see some of those ethical principles kind of manifest themselves. And of course, talk to knowledge keepers and elders, language speakers. They'll be a great resource. I always tell people learn with humility. You know, so you know, it's very important that, you know, we don't know everything, and especially if we're already established professionals and, you know, we understand duty ethics, it's important to kind of come in and understand how these things could potentially strengthen our practice and strengthen who we are. And celebrate and share your own professional code of ethics. And that's, you know, what I'm doing. So through my mino-pimachiowin code of ethics, you know, I'm exploring it on my own and developing it. It's really important that, you know, I share it with my fellow people. And of course, like I said, this is certainly not alone. This is an important and evolving research area. And so a virtue ethics approach to professional ethics can enrich material of professional ethics courses and help foster a sense of pride and responsibility amongst professionals. And so this came from an ethical study in engineering ethics. There's a lot of research on this point. We're seeing ethical theory moving a little more from duty into virtue-based into the person in response to, you know, strengthening ethical practice and ethical theory. So I'll pass it back to Matt. There you go, Matt.
Excellent. Thank you, John. So I hope we've shown a positive connection between Indigenous peoples and the engineering profession through engineering design as well as engineering ethics. And I mentioned before that we are underrepresented in the engineering profession as Indigenous peoples. That being said, we do have quite a few Indigenous engineering role models. So I'll end the presentation by highlighting just a handful of some of the great students and professional engineers that are out there. So let's go through these slides relatively quickly. We've got Danielle Brewster, a chemical engineering student at the U of S, Connor Theoretz, finishing up his master's in environmental engineering at the U of S, and Harrison Bull, also finishing up a master's at the U of S in environmental engineering. We've got Jordan Gonda, a civil engineer on the left. We've got Sarah Gauthier, a faculty member at the U of S in the College of Engineering. She is a civil engineer and a member of the Lac La Ronge Indian Bands. In the blue shirt, we've got Evan Corrigal, a Métis mechanical engineer. On the right, we've got Desiree Hainault, a Dene civil engineer. We've got Thomas Laverne, an environmental engineer who works for the Saskatchewan Research Council, helping to remediate old abandoned uranium mine sites. We've got Shanoa Tracy, a Métis mechanical engineer. We've got Duncan Cree, a Mohawk mechanical engineering professor, also at the U of S. There's Evan Corrigal again. We've got Gayleen Lara. She's a engineering physics student. I believe she's finishing up her master's as well. On the right is Brielle Thorson, chemical engineering student at Queen's, receiving an award from Melanie Howard, the director of the Queen's University Aboriginal Access to Engineering program. We've got Jacob Calderon, also a chemical engineering student at Queen's University. I think Brielle, I might have said chemical. She's a applied math and mechanical engineering students. We've got Caitlin Brandt, another Queen's student. This is Denise Poitier, a chemical engineer who works for Stantec. We've got Dennis Michelson, an electrical engineer, also a member of Kayak. We've got Deanna Berjart, a chemical engineer who's also involved with Kayak and AISES. We've got Jason Basiluk, an electrical engineer originally from Saskatchewan, now at the University of Toronto. We've got Jessica Vandenberg, a chemical engineer, works at the University of Alberta. And we've got the Randy Herman. He needs no introduction. He's the director of the Engineering Access Program at the University of Manitoba. So again, just a highlight of a handful of Indigenous engineering students and professionals. They're all super awesome. And those are just people from Saskatchewan and Canada. We didn't even get into the States. And that certainly is not an exhaustive list, just what we were able to throw together for this presentation. Thanks again. Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, for attending this session. I'll stop the recording, and then we will transfer over magically to the live Q&A. Thanks for checking this out. If you do have any follow-up questions and you're not able to join the Q&A, you can reach out to us through social media channels, or our Gmail for the Saskatchewan Professional Chapter is Sask.caISES@gmail.com. We don't check it that regularly, but we'll try. We'll try to check it regularly in case people do start sending emails our way. So with that, I will end the recording.
Thanks, everyone.